John Milton is generally conceived as a Renaissance writer, an English Renaissance writer. Here's John Milton in The Living Plaster. And as maybe one of the greatest English Renaissance writers, though he actually writes Paradise Lost in what we call the Restoration, and sometimes called part of the long 18th century, the historical period that's, for our next two units, the period from 1660 on into the end of the 1700s. But he looks back to early modern and Renaissance ways of thinking. He writes more like Shakespeare and Spenser than he does like the poets of the period when he was writing Paradise Lost. He's kind of a throwback, though he's also doing major advances in terms of like he's moving English poetry forward and further than it's ever been in some ways, and he's not shy about it. He is really setting out to be the great English poet, and it's a pretty convincing case. When he says in the beginning of Book One of Paradise Lost that he's going to attempt things yet unattempted in prose or rhyme, he means it. He's going to fly with no middle flight, and that's understatement there. He's going to fly very high. That's not a middle height, that's way up there. Let's explain where Milton exists in history, because he's very tied to the religion, politics, and history of his day. Starting in 1642, more or less, historians can quibble, we have what is called the English Civil War, a revolution or a war between different parties inside England, primarily between the king and the royalists, the people who back the king, and parliament. It is the legislature versus the monarch. The monarch is absolutist. He's tried at various points to rule without having a parliament at all for years at a time. And it's not working. He's also tends to be more what is called high church, if not Catholic, closer to Catholic, sympathetic with Catholicism. The parliamentary side of things tends to have a different class position, tends to have a very different set of religious principles. It tends to be strongly, though not exclusively, Puritan. These are the hardline Protestants who want to change the church and make it more radically Protestant. Milton is very much associated with Puritanism and with the parliamentary side of things. His Christianity starts out as very hardcore Puritan and eventually evolves into something fairly idiosyncratic. He doesn't really fit in any boxes, but he's more like a Puritan than he's like anything else. He's surely no Catholic. This culminates after 7 years of bloody warfare, English versus English, with the capture, trial, and execution of the king. Parliament puts King Charles I on trial for treason. He says, you can't try me, I'm the king, I try you. And their answer is no. They cut off his head. They rule England for 11 years with no king at all, in a period they call the Commonwealth. It is led by the Lord Protector, Oliver Cromwell, one of the generals from the Revolutionary Army. Royalists call it the interregnum, the period between the kings. It's really a commonwealth. Where does, and not for nothing, Shakespeare's theater, Shakespeare's been dead for a while, but his theater and the other theaters like it all get closed down in 1642. End of the party. Civil War and Parliament ends that era of theater history. Where does Milton fall in all this? He's been a very ambitious young poet. He's written a lot of shorter poems that are highly formally interesting, and he's a great talent, though he hasn't written a masterwork yet. He is on the parliamentary side of things. He joins Cromwell's government. He joins the Commonwealth government as basically the foreign secretary. He's writing letters in Latin as part of diplomacy with other countries. His eyesight is failing. His doctors tell him, John Milton, your eyesight is failing. To preserve what little eyesight you have left, you have to stop doing all this close work. All this scrunched up reading and writing is going to leave you totally blind if you don't stop it. But it's the revolution. And Milton believes, and this is his chance to serve that revolution. So he keeps working, reading, writing, squinting with his failing eyesight until he is completely blind. In 1660, the revolution Milton gave his eyesight for fails. The kings come back. This is what we mean by the restoration. Meet the new boss, same as the old boss, by which I mean he's the son of the old boss. Charles II comes back. Okay. How does King Charles II feel about people who rebelled against Charles I, his father, and executed them? You get one guess. Milton falls from power. Milton loses most of his fortune. Milton narrowly escapes execution as a radical. He is left relatively impoverished, completely blind, with the revolution he sacrificed for gone. And the thing he loved least in the world, the monarchy, back. That is when he writes Paradise Lost. An epic justifying God's way to man, an attempt, a very successful attempt, at the great English epic poem, which is not merely English, but going to be an epic poem for all time, for humanity. Let's start with Adam and Eve. He is going to add parts to the Bible. He's that confident. But he writes part of this poem in his head, in blank verse, every morning, lying there blind, waiting for someone to show up to write it down for him. He is downcast, he is defeated, he has sacrificed for nothing, he is completely blind, he is the greatest English poet alive. And that's how this poem gets written.